So as you can see, my presentation is about silent film scoring as the basis for a composition curriculum at the pre-college level. And I suppose the first thing we should do is talk about the who's, what's, where's, when's, and so forth. So if this is intended to work, there we go. Where, although I'm at SUNY Potsdam now, this happened while I was at Stony Brook University, first as a graduate student and as an adjunct faculty member. Stony Brook, for those who don't know, is on Long Island, relatively near New York City. When the period in question was from August 2008 to December 2015. What? The community music programs of Stony Brook, the pre-college division. And who? Well, the students were generally middle and high school students, primarily the latter, but also with some middle school students as well, younger folks. And then the instructors were current and former graduate students. So I fell into both categories at different times. So the parameters that we were working with within this program were, first of all, that the program met each Saturday during the academic year. Now, the primary focus of the program was on chamber music performance, although other forms of musical expression gained prominence over time, one of them being composition and another one being vocal music performance became a more important part of the program as time went on. We had 2 semesters, each of which culminated in a lengthy concert, as such programs generally do. And each session lasted 4 hours, typically from 10 to 2, with 2 class sessions of 75 minutes in the morning and afternoon. And in between were a master class, typically, followed by or also 1 or more breaks. And students would take a performance class in one session, either the morning or evening, or afternoon, sorry, depending on which they were scheduled for. And then at the other time, they would take a combined theory and oral skills class. And this was the status quo when I arrived and became a part of the program in 2008. Now, by design and by policy, this was not a program that was primarily intended to prepare students for highly competitive environments or for testing. So there was actually a formal statement of this in our curriculum overview, which I wrote in 2013, which noted that these classes are not intended to be preparatory courses for the AP exam, any other standardized test, nor are they meant to be an elite-style college prep program with heavily standardized instruction, extensive quizzing, and the like. And I began working with this program in August 2008. I became the head theory instructor in 2013 before I accepted the position I now hold at the Crane School of Music in Potsdam at the start of 2016. So what were some of the challenges that this program experienced? I think my screen will update in just a moment. I hope so. I don't know if you're seeing the same thing I am, but suddenly it's not updating. Here we go. First of all, there were a large number of returning students, which is actually a very good problem to have. But as a consequence, because we only offered 2 levels of theory and oral skills, there was always a danger of having a kind of Groundhog Day effect, where students who came back, especially for the 3rd year and thenceforth, would be intensely aware that we had done the same thing, for whatever definition of one has of the same thing, in the previous year. And that's obviously a challenge as an instructor. Imagine teaching theory 2 to the same student 4 or 5 times in a row. More generally, we had to keep the program compelling for returning students and also accessible to new students. So another challenge was that we had students, and again, this is a good problem to have in some sense, with very disparate levels of skill and experience, right? And I'm defining skill in the most conventional sense. So some of them were very flashy in terms of their technique and ability, and others were definitely beginners. Very different socioeconomic backgrounds and levels of privilege, right? So some came from very affluent families and others came from quite the opposite. Excuse me. Different levels of commitment to music as a field of study or profession. Some students were clearly gearing up for an academic career in music or a professional career in music, while others, even at that stage, clearly had their sights set on a different field of work, but nonetheless had obviously some degree of passion for music. And different levels of access to and experience with music technology, right? And this also ties into the thing about levels of socioeconomic privilege. Some students didn't have a laptop or any kind of desktop computer at home, nor did they have recording devices. Other students had an entire suite of such things. And we had no mechanism for holding students accountable for any homework we might assign or for projects done at home, etc. And this, of course, also has an angle of economic justice in that if we assign homework that can be done on a home computer, students who don't have one are obviously at a disadvantage. So composition in the program had a kind of evolving role. In 2009, it formally became the terminal stage of theory. So in other words, we would have theory 1, followed by theory 2, and then composition. And that composition class would repeat thereafter. So it would essentially be where students would occupy that half of their time from that point forward. Before this, composition was treated as a secondary part of theory. So in other words, our theory classes would include a composition component, but it was never their main purpose, at least not formally. And in 2011, the curriculum we had was formally transitioned to a film scoring-based curriculum, and we moved into a multi-user computer lab. So I have a curricular document here, which I don't particularly need to read at the moment, but it formalizes the above things. And maybe one thing to note is that we were using Logic Pro, Logic Pro X, and another thing is that we were ultimately finishing each semester, or sometimes each year, with a silent film score, and we'll talk about that later. So here's a picture of the site, and as you can see, it's a relatively normal multi-user computer lab with keyboards at each workstation, among other things, although that changed with time. So why film scoring? Well, I don't know why it keeps not refreshing, but we'll deal with it. So what are some good things about film scoring as the basis for this curriculum? Well, one of them is that it avoids requiring notation as a barrier to entry, right? So in other words, students who aren't comfortable with notation still can prosper. Another is that it inherently involves a music technology component, so that students gain skill in that department simply by dint of the subject itself. And as we all know, I think people who score films generally have a high level of technological literacy, both within music and otherwise. It offers opportunities for collaboration between students. It's very few of us have really written a piece together with somebody else, but many of us might work together on a film score or other project in which there's a multimedia element. It offers a prompt to students' imagination. There's always stuff going on screen that can trigger students to think in ways they might not otherwise think. It encourages students to experiment with cliches and humor and other things that are common tropes in the vocabulary of conventional music, and that allows them to become better, more critical listeners. If you want to take a somewhat cynical view on things, it would be that since so much of the music we listen to on a daily basis manipulates us in some way, if we learn how to do the manipulating ourselves, we become able to critically interrogate that phenomenon when we encounter it as part of our travels. And finally, it provides a forum for musical creation that gets away from the baggage of the romantic baggage of art as a kind of personal expression, which for many adolescents in particular can be a challenging way to view art and can make it seem very heavy. Now, silent film scoring in particular has some nice advantages. One of them is that students don't have to deal with spoken dialogue, which is a real art in and of itself and was outside the scope of what I was looking to do. Another is that it might implicitly cue students to adopt period styles, but it also offers a wide open canvas so that they can experiment with any number of other styles, and many of them did. It allows interested students to engage in Foley work, in other words, to come up with sound effects, which a bunch of them embraced. Public domain is a big issue here. So if we use public domain films, which with some exceptions are almost always silent films, then we can exhibit them and publish them on things like YouTube channels without having to worry about copyright. And I liked the idea that it encourages students to engage and appreciate the creative work of a past era on sympathetic terms, right? In other words, instead of viewing it as something remote made by these strange people we couldn't possibly understand, instead we learned to approach it collegially and with a sympathetic perspective. So my explicit pedagogical goals were to get students writing music, a bunch of different styles and on very different timescales, to develop their technological literacy skills, both within music technology and also in general with computers, to acquaint them with the cinematic vocabulary of silent film, to give them training and skills that would likely be relevant to any of them who were continuing in music, and to give them an opportunity to work creatively and, importantly, constructively in a collaborative setting. There are also some implicit goals, one of which was to demystify the act of composition. We often think about the solitary genius composing entire pieces presumably for orchestral instruments in their head, and then they use notation to set down that unique brilliance, right? And that's the vehicle through which they communicate with the people who perform their work. I liked to posit composition as a more participatory, social, and playful act that's accessible to anybody, and that takes place on a continuum where every level of skill, every level of seriousness, and every level of innovation is considered legitimate and allows somebody to identify as a composer. And on similar note, let me just see if I can get that. There we go. I like to challenge student self-definitions. Many of them would say, oh, I'm not a composer, or I'm not a computer person. And I liked the idea that this class could help them to challenge that and to think along different lines. So the early weeks of the course would focus mainly on acquiring certain technical skills. And I'll go through this relatively quickly, because I think many of us are familiar with the kind of prospectus of things we are looking for from students. But one of them would be general computing skills, which are obviously essential to navigate the environment they were in. They needed to know how to use Mac OS. Things like undo were always worth reminding them of, and more generally, how things like file systems work. How to work in a multi-user Media Lab environment. We'll talk about some issues relating to that a bit later. Developing a working knowledge of the on-site hardware and its quirks, and there sure were many of them. Developing good troubleshooting skills, and on a related note, developing good habits when seeking help. Telling me, help, it's not working, is not particularly helpful. Telling me, I created an arpeggiator and it was working for a while, but now it stopped working, and I've created a second instance and that's also not working, what should I do next, is a much better question. Developing good habits as a user, so backing up their data appropriately, not trying to work directly from very slow flash thumb drives. These were things that they learned in the course of our work together. And then music technology skills were also relevant, so understanding dualities like MIDI versus audio, what a synthesizer is versus a sampler, what lossless audio is versus lossy audio like MP3. Understanding how signal paths and things like that operate, distortion, what that would come from and how to get rid of it, and then the difference between mono and stereo and multi-channel sound and how to take advantage of that. And also understanding things like quantization and click tracks, how they could be used appropriately and when they definitely must be used. So the early weeks of the course also would teach them general composition concepts and techniques, things that are familiar to many of us, like thinking about contrast, repetition, development, and other things as fundamental building blocks of the art. Also techniques that would disrupt the predictability of things they might want to do. I think anybody who's worked with music technology knows that you get a whole lot of projects that are in 4/4, at 120 beats per minute in C major unless you do something about it. So I encourage them to use transposition, to elide things, to randomize things, to vary their tempo and meter, to use Brian Eno's oblique strategies cards, things like that. And then also techniques that we all use all the time to add weight to a gesture, like doubling it, or that give continuity, like creating transitions between segments as opposed to just juxtaposing them. Techniques involving spectrum, thinking about register and manipulating timbres in various ways. Understanding the strengths and weaknesses of computer-aided compositional environments and the kinds of things that it tries to encourage you to do, and you have to kind of make an effort not to be swayed by those biases. And then using effects to create a sense of place, space, or presence. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. And then learning the DAW itself, in other words, the digital audio workstation and how logic worked. So an early assignment in my class would tend to focus on one or two technical skills, and they would use brief prompts if they were meant to be completed within the period of a class. That would be an assignment. A project would have more extensive guidelines and would span multiple classes. In the early stages, I tended to use either mock commercials as their prompt, in other words, make a commercial for something, we'll see an example in a moment, or a scenario akin to the script for a radio drama where I wanted them to hit certain time points and create certain oral narratives. One thing is that with a 75-minute class period, completing these things within that was often a time pressure situation, and I viewed that as a good thing because it encouraged them to develop the skill to use the computer and the DAW rapidly. It encouraged them to focus on creating rather than becoming perfectionistic, and to be spontaneous and to trust the felicity of things that could happen unexpectedly. And it lowers the stakes because you really can't do that much in 75 minutes. So a sample assignment, which I'll re-render here. Come on. There we go. In week 2, I would say to them, a charitable organization asked you to make a 15-second PSA to help raise money for malnourished penguins. I'm sure we've seen that commercial many times. And they have some odd requirements as to style and to instrumentation. And then a bit later, I might ask them to record an advertisement for a European dance club. It has to be exactly 60 seconds long. It has to use synthesizers. And something I think is rather clever, actually, is asking them to include the best parts of 3 imaginary songs, which I think is a great exercise to write something and have it only be the best part, if you understand what I mean. So then if we moved into projects, we had more elaborate scenarios. This was, for instance, one where I asked them to pick one of 5 scenarios, and the only sound source they were allowed to use was something that came more or less directly from their body or voice, right? So they could vocalize, they could tap their body, they could do all manner of things along those lines, but they weren't allowed to use synthesizers or loops or anything like that. And the other thing they could use would be effects, right? So doing that and automating those effects was a big part of the assignment. So let's see if I can get the scenarios. There we go. So the scenarios I particularly like and that I think lend themselves to specific use of effects were one in which 2 professional wrestlers try to threaten each other, but a helium leak suddenly makes them sound a lot less tough. And then number 5, a man and his dog are trapped at the bottom of a well and they're both getting hungry. And as the owner of a half Doberman, I hope never to live that scenario out myself. So there were also some pedagogical goals. One of them that I didn't disclose, right? This wasn't part of the assignment I gave them, but developing their audio recording skills, developing skills with FX and automation, creating a convincing narrative without relying on conventional musical devices, and creating material from scratch rather than relying on the pre-supplied stuff that comes with Logic. Using humor and play, I think that's pretty obvious here, and to make them less self-conscious, and to encourage collaboration. Here is another project, which I don't think I'll go through for time reasons, but again, this is a case where the time points are quite well scripted, and their ability to use effects in an intelligent way is a big part of what's happening here. So, with later assignments and projects, we would transition to scoring actual film footage, and most of these would come from the Internet Archive. Most of what we could find on the Internet Archive would be in the public domain, either because it had been placed there intentionally, or the copyright was never filed properly, or at the time because it had been released prior to 1923. Now, that clock, which was on pause for a long, long time, 20 years, has finally resumed ticking. So now everything up to 1926 would actually be fair game for such a program. And it only applies to silent film. As soon as you bring in audio, we are dealing with a patchwork of state laws which were recently addressed by Congress, but it's still a complicated situation. They're also welcome to bring in their own video work, although few did. And it's really important when dealing with anything from before from any era really, to vet it for any material that might be inappropriate for the classroom, either for obvious reasons of changing social standards or because there might be subject matter that would be triggering. There was a Harold Lloyd film I would have loved to use, but it contained a mock suicide, and so that was out. And the semester project would be the collaborative composition of a complete score for a short silent film. We'd watch it as a class, divide it up into segments, and then assign those segments to small groups, or individual students sometimes. And some of the scores we completed are as follows. We did the 1910 production of Frankenstein, which is quite strange. Other films you may know, A Trip to the Moon, directors you'll know, Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton. I made the mistake of using some footage from 1934, which was under a Creative Commons license, but not public domain, so unfortunately we couldn't publish that. And then the very, very weird 1910 version of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which is like a fever dream version of the movie we all know. So, what were some of the challenges that I encountered? We encountered? Well, working in a multi-user multimedia lab is inherently challenging. The files were deleted all the time, so everything had to be backed up to thumb drives every week, which was obviously a hassle and ate into class time. I sometimes did it after class myself, just for the sake of timing. Equipment would malfunction, as with any lab that large. And at one point, a faculty member at Stony Brook wanted all loops and virtual instruments to be deleted from all those machines for pedagogical reasons. They didn't want their students using those as a kind of crutch. But that, unfortunately, was a huge problem for me and my pedagogy, so we had to have some back and forth about that until finally a solution was found that was good. Semester projects were sometimes endangered by last-minute student absences, right? If somebody just bails out 3 weeks from the end, it created a real problem. It was non-trivial to find appropriate film material. I, in retrospect, encouraged a lot of Mickey Mousing, which is a term of art for when something happens on screen and every time somebody does anything, there's a little noise to go with it. And that can be a little corny after a while, although I think in the context it was okay, but I probably should have had a little less of that going on. And finally, students with economic privilege were always at an advantage, right? They could always work on stuff at home, but that also made them among the most helpful contributors, so in a way it was a source of strength. And what were some successes? Well, students got better, both at music technology and composing. They became stronger and stronger year after year. And one thing that was very interesting, though, and a nice surprise, was that students who had very little technical skill in a formal sense often wrote really interesting, weird music, which was great. And more generally, their unique voices emerged over time, and despite the fact that we were basing class in a non-notational and largely vernacular practice, students still used notation and used conventionally known sophisticated compositional devices if they wanted to. Right? In other words, it was available to them, simply not required of them. The scores were very well received by the students' peers, and in fact, I think that often they achieved a higher standard than a lot of commercial silent film scores I've seen on DVD, TCM, many of which are quite terrible. I think my students did quite a bit better than that, and their peers, when we had screenings, would all laugh in the right places and would receive it very warmly. And finally, the composition program became a very strong factor in student retention. I think there were students who came back year after year specifically to participate in that program, which was nice. And speaking of students, I had, finally, this is my last subsegment, email interview prompts. I contacted a handful of former students, the ones I could find with relative ease, and asked them some questions about what we did together, questions about what the most memorable occasion was, what skills that they had acquired that went on to benefit them, and a brief description of our composition classes together. And the prompts I won't go through, obviously, verbatim here, both for time reasons and because I'd imagine that there may be an opportunity to publish this material, as a group. In other words, we all upload our PowerPoints and PDFs and what have you later on. But what I want to draw attention to is that in response to the first prompt, almost everybody specifically called out silent film scoring as the thing that meant the most to them. That was something spontaneous. The prompt didn't specifically mention silent film, but over and over again they said that was the thing that really stuck with them. In response to the second prompt, a bunch of my students ended up going on to participate in music in the long term in some way. One went to Juilliard, two of them went on to major in sound recording in college, another one is still composing music, and I actually continue to work with him privately. So that was very nice, and also seeing that students felt that they had an advantage in their collegiate theory courses because they had had experience both with theory and also with composition. And then finally, the prompt, let me make that render. The last prompt, it was very interesting because as far as I know, these students didn't communicate with each other in response to my prompts, but certain words kept reoccurring, words like engaging, twice the word explorative occurred, which was an interesting surprise. I wasn't expecting that. But ultimately, it seemed as though my students found these classes to be liberating and stimulating and memorable, and in some cases transformative. So I was very pleased and touched that the feedback I got seemed to be extremely positive. Now, I have a short excerpt that we could play, but I think probably should not, since I know that I'm about at the 22-minute mark. However, if you don't have too many questions, we could try to if we have 3 minutes to fit it in. Otherwise, I finish up with this, with the lovely, beautiful face of the 1910 Frankenstein, and thank you very much for your attention.
Actually, Phil, we have a little bit of time to watch this excerpt, if it's okay.
Oh, I don't think I can hear anybody.
Yeah. Phil, I think we have time to watch this excerpt.
Oh, great. Wonderful. Then, okay, let's do it then. I will probably have to reshare my screen because, like all of us, my technological abilities are imperfect, but here we go. stop there. But yeah, so that's an example of my students' work. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. That was really inspiring. And also as a public school magnet program with students, I definitely would love to use your system of filming scoring for silent film. It was wonderful. Thank you so much. We have time for a few questions. Like 2 to 3 questions. Anyone have any questions?
Hi, I'm Jimmy. At some point in the presentation, you talked about having pedagogical goals for your students that you didn't disclose to them. And I was wondering if you could speak about why you wouldn't disclose a pedagogical goal to students and what would make you want to disclose a pedagogical goal versus not disclose it.
Oh, sure. And, I think that when I say that I didn't disclose them, for the most part, what I mean is I didn't formally include them as part of the assignment guidelines. So when I talk about them developing audio recording skills using effects, things like that, that would be something that I would unhesitatingly affirm in the appropriate context. I think if you were to tell students, I am encouraging you to use humor to make you less self-conscious about your work, I think that would itself add a layer of self-consciousness to the process that would be counterproductive, right? In other words, I'm sort of a believer that in certain cases one wants to do the equivalent of show rather than tell, and so I would worry that if I allowed them to have too much of a meta-narrative about what they were doing, it would actually be exactly contrary to what I was trying to get them to do, which is to sort of get rid of all their meta-narratives about what it means to create, what it means to be a composer, and instead find themselves in the thick of it before then finding a moment to pause and reflect, as the students I contacted clearly did, about their experiences and realizing that they had done certain things without really thinking about the fact that they were doing them at the time. So I hope that addresses any concerns that you might have in that regard.
Thank you. We have time for just one more question. Okay.
Hi, I'm Aaron Helgeson. I teach at Montclair State University. I want to ask if you were just working with the virtual instruments and sample libraries that come built in with Logic. And part of the reason I asked the question is I've found that with students who are working with particularly film scoring for the first time and MIDI, that actually it's really great for confidence to work with some sound libraries and virtual instruments that are a little bit more robust, like Spitfire Studios makes a free set of instruments called Labs, which I've found to be really, really useful. But I'm curious, why Logic and what kind of samples you were using with the students?
Sure. So why Logic? It would be mainly because it was there and because I had extensive experience with it. I don't remember if Pro Tools was on those machines. I want to say it wasn't, nor were Cubase or any number of other alternatives. So Logic was the campus standard and the department standard. I would have loved to be able to use additional sample libraries. The problem was that it was a massively multi-user environment, so there are issues of things like site licensing. And even if I were to use freely downloadable sample libraries, I think at the time the University of Ohio, I want to say, had put out some nice samples that actually I used in a couple of my undergraduate classes. The problem was I didn't have administrative level access to those machines. And in any event, anything I would do would then need to be potentially recopied in its entirety onto the same machine the following week, because they did have a policy of essentially every machine being a kind of tabula rasa. So nothing could persist. So we were kind of writing on the sand every week, and anything going much beyond that would require a great deal of pre-class intervention on my part, which I think I just didn't have the bandwidth to spend an hour before class copying samples over every week, although it would no doubt have been worth it. But yeah, had we had control over the environment, had I been able to customize the computers as I saw fit, I would have loved to expand in those ways. It just, we were essentially tertiary users of that space, lucky to have it at all, so.
Okay, well, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much.